We're live, Doug.
All right. It's Friday, October 9th, and it is Flash Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Mr.
Indeed.
Kidda, I have a little deeper peel on security, permissions, some Azure AD, reprisal, something maybe people didn't pay attention to from Ignite, and some recent announcements out of Azure AD for some GA stuff. So that's what I got going on today. Probably a shorter show, given that we've sort of drained the swamp of announcements, but there's some good stuff. What do you got?
No, I have some. I've got also a little light, but that's all right. I've got some cool stuff for Power Automate and a Power BI thing.
Sweet. So I'm up first. So the first one is not as happy of a topic as I would like to do. It's a deep dive on some Android malware that has a tremendous evolution of what people are doing. As we know, everyone says, oh, these new different classes of devices are quote unquote more secure. It just changes the threat vector. It doesn't, it's nothing's, if you're going to build software from all these different components, then it's going to be all combined together. No matter how the mashup happens, no matter what vehicle it has, you have to have comprehensive trust and absolute authoritative security and governance controls over every single component that gets mashed onto a device. That's really hard. The more software you put on a device, doesn't matter the source of software, if it's from an app store or a click on a web browser. And obviously store curation has been a challenge to do security because all the embedded components, how some things lie dormant, like it's really hard.
Especially
right?
on certain platforms,
Yeah, some platforms. Well, I might dispute that one, Todd, that the platform matters anymore. But we can have that academic or cocktail beverage debate some other time.
Store curation? Okay.
I think that not everyone is. It's a challenge for all vendors. I don't think there's a huge advantage in that space. But there used to be a technique for Android ransomware where you do a system alert window and you sort of take over the full real estate. And normal threat vectors kind of crush that one. This article goes through it. However, there's a whole new breed of threat vectors on top of it, which is hijacking the call notification and the on user leave hint stuff. So
horrible.
Much deeper misuse of the APIs to seize control of the device. Now, obviously, this means it had to get on there somehow. So either through an app you installed from a store or something you sideloaded or whatever it is. Doesn't matter how it got on there. If you have an app that have one of these components into it, but people install a lot of convenience apps.
Yes, they do.
Right? Which is why we're so, if you're going to trusted software development life cycles and trusted publishers and vendors is critical for any platform. End of story. So this one's interesting. They talk about, and I don't know if people saw that, it used to be like, Windows Defender, right? And then it was Microsoft Defender because it went cross-platform. And it was Defender Advanced Threat Protection. Now it's just Microsoft Defender for endpoint, which makes complete sense. We're going to defend the endpoints. We're going to defend the threats against endpoints for all the platforms we support. But I think this is if you're a security person, it's just a good reminder as to why some of these components we put down to inspect component trust, right? Which we cannot do without device management often, right? Mm-hmm. That you put the device portfolio at risk, which is why encryption standards and everything else are so important. So it's just a good reminder. It's pretty nerdy, but if you like that kind of thing, go check it out. Just gives you an example, some hardcore examples is exactly why this stuff matters and why we pay so much attention to having these trusted components and signed things and everything else. Okay, so enough of Doug's rant on top of that one. There was a kind of an interesting one on the Sharepoint blog. And I don't know how often people have to do this, but I've had to do it in the past. And it talks about the ability to retrieve a complete set of permission changes using the Delta Links token. So this is, if you've ever had to do this, sort of like permission scanning and digest, there's an actual nice link for aka.ms/scan guidance, which talks about the best practices for discovering files and detecting changes at scale, right? And so it talks about like the proper calling patterns and everything else. And they had a nice example, some code on top of it with exactly what you need to do for manifesting it. And then some sample code and example how to use, like the different things to walk through the 2 stages of executing the code to get back essentially your enumerated permission sets for Delta permission changes. So if you need that level of forensic analysis of permission changes, so you have that.
What am I getting? I'm getting a log or a digest?
Yeah, you're just getting a raw output of it.
Of current state or
Delta
time?
State, change state.
Yep. So I can see Doug had access to this document from this date to this date.
No, you're seeing the permission manifest change within the audited window.
Okay.
Not Doug's durability of that, right? Because So now theoretically, you could use this technique to establish those things and then vault them somewhere, right? But remember, we only keep things forensically for so long. So if you're in a highly regulatory compliant environment, this is kind of an interesting thing where we faced challenges around automation on this before. I've only really done it with super regulated customers. Have I really gone down these roads before? But it is something that, sort of put it in your back pocket. If you're in regulated industry and you haven't been forensically. Now, here's the other thing too is, as soon as you can do something, then you have to decide, should you do it, and are you willing to keep doing it? So this is one of those ones where, okay, so if no one's requiring you to do it, I wouldn't necessarily start.
Don't sign yourself up.
But at the same time, you should understand what your options are, and if your compliance regulations require that level of how to do Delta, use this. This just has a nice API sample. So anyway, I told you I was going super nerdy on stuff.
Something that I was necessarily plugged into. I'm gonna check the link out after the show and kind of dive a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those where it is. I admit this. The audience size for this one shrinks to a super small group, but I'm happy that. We talk about signals of platform maturity at times, Todd. To me, this is one of those moments like we're down to here, and I kind of like that. So
yeah, this is a stuff.
But then the best practices around scoping the permission scope on top of it, the calling pattern as to how to discover, crawl, notify, and then process changes in the recommended. And it also goes in the crawl and process by using the Delta query, right, on top of it. So it shows the graph hierarchy for using the Delta. Right. And so you can pop into Graph Explorer and play around with this. Oh. And then you can get notified of changes using webhooks, right? This is where I said, but then what are you going to do with that, right? So so you have on top of that for doing it, and you get the scanning permissions. And then they have, of course, I'm super happy they included this. What happens, not if. What happens when you get, I like that. I would feel better if it had if/when, right? Yeah. So if or when you get throttled. And so it does say, hey, here's how you got to come back with the recovery window for the retry after. And so anyway, I thought it was a nice thing about doing webhook for these permission changes and everything else. So if you need that kind of thing, there you go.
Wonderful.
Okay. Shall we have a little Azure AD fun and things on top of it? Okay. So conditional access to Azure the Access Office 365 suite for conditional access is now available. Sort of enough said. If you didn't know that you couldn't do that before, you couldn't, right? So now you can just basically say, hey, look, I can have a consistent enforcement policy across the Office 365 apps. All right. Now, if you do this, you are applying a consistent policy across the estate. You can't go back and, I mean, I shouldn't say you can't, but you are enforcing that policy, and therefore you're going to have to go back to ordinal and rule out and everything else if you want to do something different. So I think this is going to be very common for people to take this approach to say, I don't want to micromanage the individual apps, but make your choice.
So does this includes the classic? Look
at the icon gallery is there. The band's back together. They're all on the screen, right? Cool. They're all good to go on top of it. So yeah, I don't know. Now I've had some people say, well, I would never do. I would flexibility and control. I was like, sure. But now those who are like, look, man, click, right? So we got you both covered. Whatever pick your poison on top of it.
People using Word on the Starbucks network, I couldn't do that, I guess.
Yeah. So now also, publisher verification and app consent policies are now generally available. So this one, tune in a little. All right. So because at Ignite, they announced the GA of it on top of it, right? And they announced public preview at Build in May, which essentially says that I'm going to go ahead and allow certain publishers, right? And in order to have that, and for differentiation, so on top of it, so you can have publisher verification for applications on top of it.
Okay.
So you get this sort of verification, right? And then you can have user consent updates for unverified publishers. So in other words, you can say, end users will no longer be able to consent to multi-tenant apps from unverified publishers. Well, duh. Speaking of App Store frameworks, right? And trusted ecosystems. So, and then the GA of the app consent policies, right? Which says customers can manage settings for user consent by choosing from the built-in app consent policies in the screen below, which says essentially do not allow for app consent, right? Allow user consent from verified publishers or allow user consent for any apps, which the bottom one I would never, the middle one's the right choice. Vote. Vote early, vote often. No, just vote. And so they can also use Azure AD and PowerShell to create custom consent policies for even more control. So if you don't like those, then there's not a UI. Remember the show, mind the gap, right? The reason the logo looks like it looks is because there's a GUI, an API, and a power something for everything in this universe. In this particular case, we're saying, hey, here's the PowerShell commandlets in order to go ahead and put in a new permission manifest. I have not seen how granular those permission manifests are, but I would go check them out if you don't like the out-of-the-box ones. It seems like there's more levers and knobs. I just haven't checked all of the ingredient frameworks on top of that. The last one for me was a roll-up of announcements that happened at Ignite. So one of the Azure AD team, Subon from over on the Azure AD team, put up, hey, here are what they think are the top 7 identity partnership announcements at Ignite 2020. And I like this one because it wasn't like first party stuff, right? It's like, what are we doing in the ecosystem of things to make it better for things that were going? And one, if you remember, so the system for cross-domain identity management, the automated skip skim type provisioning stuff that we've covered probably back in the episode 10s and 20s, right? Where we're trying to get to federated identity synchronization between SaaS providers, right? First, there was sort of over-the-air, like in-flight dynamic provisioning, where if you had the first time you access the app, it sent a manifest in, right, with your authentication payload that would allow people to sort of pave the way for you as you went in. That was a common way for SaaS applications to get provisioned. You just include a manifest in the authentication token or the authorization token after authentication from Azure AD, and the app will go, oh, look, Todd, you have cost center, whatever, and group membership, whatever. So if you went to like a CRM system, it could blow out the permissions. But that was a one-time tattoo, right? Like there was no way to have attributes come back. With skim and skip type provisionings, you can, in theory, allow for bidirectional or controlled channel updates over a federated identity management system. And so this has been one of those things where I've been super big fan of this. If you go back to like the federal ICAM architecture, which is the reference architecture the government put forth that sort of encompasses the NIST 853 specifications for what's governance and federation and provisioning and identity, some of these cross-domain, the translations, identity mapping, and attribute synchronization and staying current are greatly eased if you get into skim skip. What do people do if they don't have this, Todd? If you're provisioning some other SaaS application, you're like exchanging CSVs, making custom API calls, you're doing proprietary graph calls. You know, you did something. Like most people have batch jobs. A CSV comes down and I import it. You know what I mean? Like there's all those sort of scrubbed things, but they're batch jobs as opposed to more transactional in nature. And so the goal is to make it easier to manage the user lifecycle across the Adobe Experience Cloud. Well, duh, you should do that. So there you go on top of it. By the way, we are not the only person in the identity ecosystem that does skim and skip. So the nice thing is you can have kind of a hub and spoke, sort of fans out from these different connectors that you have, depending on what your identity management and lifecycle management ecosystem looks like. So pretty cool. ServiceNow integrates with Azure AD to automate new hire onboarding. So they announced on that. Savient, who I've been working with for years and years, for advanced identity governance capabilities to it, which is a little broader in scope on their cloud PAM than what you might get for normal Azure AD governance, assuming you have that entitlement, and then expanded governance for Azure AD B2C customers on top of it. And then they talked about the strong passwordless policies on top of it, which is elusive networks, which is pretty cool. If you haven't checked that one out, I think that's interesting. And Microsoft Security and Azure AD APIs, Yubico, who you and I have been working with for years, right, for secure auth on top of that stuff. And then a whole bunch of other announcements around mission critical app access from Azure AD. So the Azure AD App Proxy can provide legacy apps. Some customers use existing application delivery networks, VPNs. So the secure hybrid access partnerships now include Palo Alto, Cisco NAConnect, Fortinet, Stratanet, and Ping. I thought Ping was already in there, so maybe the Ping expanded. I didn't unpack that one because I was kind of scratch because they were one of our original Azure AD application proxy partners for traditionally scoped legacy applications. So maybe it got reset. I don't know. Anyway, so that's a pretty comprehensive grid for application access integration with the Azure AD app proxy and these other solutions. I think we got you covered for secure access to applications on top of it.
Yeah.
So I kind of like the partners stuff on top of it. One thing I meant to dig in on, I just did not get time to do, was to look at the intelligent security graph telemetry integration updates from partners. So I'm going to try and find a presentation from Ignite and unpack that one for everybody, maybe for next week, if there was anything significant in there. Because I really wanted to know, all right, these are the active enforcement. What's our signal intelligence story? How has that evolved from the last time we did a review? So that's it, Mr. Kidda. I'm going to, by the way, I got myself a little Stream Deck thing, so I can make these transitions now without having to like do what I'm doing right now. I'll be able to do button transitions for next week, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But for right now, I'm queuing you up. So why don't you do intro while I get your content on screen?
Yeah. So what I'm going to show here when I come up is we've made some enhancements to the Power Automate analytics piece. And it's really, I think this one's important because it's not just, kind of nice to have stuff. It's really around being able to troubleshoot, dig in, and figure out, why potentially your flows have maybe changed their performance characteristics, maybe degraded in performance. And this kind of lets you dig in and lets you differentiate between a flow run, right? Which is basically just, when something is triggered, that flow runs, versus each individual action and how that affects performance. And this kind of goes through and talks about...
You don't have to do this though, right? You can just leave your abysmally performing flows alone if you've written them and you're happy.
If you're happy, dude. That's why I always tell customers, like, if this is working and you're happy, then let it.
I'm not known for writing particularly efficient things, so I don't know that I like this.
This one is really more for if you do care, right? So, and it's like, what happens? See, I like this one too. What happens when my flow runs too many actions? Not if, right?
Oh, not if.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
if. It's when.
I like how this one calls out, for instance, exceeding your daily limit by 500 actions is going to have zero impact on your performance. Whereas if you exceed it by 50,000, this may significantly impact your performance. So this is really good. It kind of talks about things that you should be looking for and how to use these newly available analytics to diagnose perf and potentially improve the performance back to where it should be. So this is really good. Definitely, if you're a big flow user and you've got things that are kind of mission critical from a performance perspective, you need to be digging into this level to figure out, how to diagnose and troubleshoot.
So observation, do you think the when, not if, for all these negative things is really due to the climate we're in right now, the lack of optimism? Like when you exceed, when you screw up, when you get hacked, when that, not if. There's just like the doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Like, come on, people, put that, other half of the glass is filled with air. It's always full of something.
It's always full of something.
So, you and I are always full of something too. All right, let's keep going. Sorry.
Pretty good. All right, so here's some new connectors that I'm going to talk about. A couple ones that stood out to me were the ones. So I'll just kind of scroll through and then talk about the ones that are related to us. Some CDK stuff, Cloud Immersive, Get Accept, ND payables. If these are relevant to you, you're probably pretty excited. But the AD identity protection and the compliance one stood out to me. So here's the AD identity protection connector, which is pretty cool. Allows you to get some risky detections, get your risky users, get a history of a risky user, which this is pretty cool. So being able to go in and put some automation around your identity protection using Flow or Logic Apps or whatever is pretty neat. So
I think that would be fascinating if you were able to construct a business flow that took that analysis maybe outside of its traditional scoped audience for handling, because the volume of some of these things occasionally require a different approach. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
I mean, to fork it off and maybe
like get it out of the security operations team. Maybe it's service desk who could resolve some of these things, because security teams are busy.
Oh yeah,
right.
Sure.
And not all threats can be handled equally. Now I know you might say these, confirm a risky user is compromised. So maybe you have the analysis, or you might be outsourcing, right? Or you have a third-party security review service and you could automate. But I'm just saying, for like staff aug, whether internal or external, for handling security events, I love this kind of stuff. So I can think of like a lot of different ways you could orchestrate something interesting around this.
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool. All right. The other one is the compliance, M365 compliance. So talking about adding risk insider risk management case note, getting communication, metadata, getting more information around insider risk. And that's what this one mostly kind of.
And that one, you almost certainly would want to bust outside of core security operations at a point and run a workflow. So you can then have a Power App that has a little, hey, Todd, you're Doug's boss. Like, give me a little context around this. Is this normal, or is Doug stealing company data?
Really actionable, and I think to your point, this kind of can bridge the gap, reduce the surface area and the friction between the back end security stuff that's going on and the actual user. Like, here's the tools, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, because the truth is, a lot of these decisions are subjective decisions that will need to be made by someone who is close to the business user whose action is being performed. And that's I was probably saying it poorly before, but that's what we call distributing the workload. Like, I don't. I come from law as a background. I spent tons of time in there, and people would say, well, I don't want anything risky to happen. I'm like, well, can you give me a quantitative, authoritative flow of what risky looks like? No, I cannot. But I know it when I see it. All right, well then, if we detect it with machine learning, let's go confirm it with humans.
It might be risky, yeah. Hey,
it might not be.
Is it? Yeah, okay.
People once said to me, copying large volumes of data. I'm like, all right, well, don't we do that when we get ready to go to trial? So we have offline access? Like, well, yeah, but not then. I'm like, okay. Then do I have a place I can find out everyone who's going to trial? No, we don't really track that anywhere. I'm like, So that's where you get some of these things where the last mile of human interaction, which is super important, and this sort of allows that democratization.
This could easily distribute that last mile, which is not to say that that's a little amount of volume, right? That could be a massive volume of things, right?
Well, then you have if you could discover that and go, wow, that's fascinating. Like we always say, you should observe before you enforce or automate, right? So maybe you just toss it into a database somewhere and go, wow,
report
that's a lot.
Yeah, visualize. Yep, totally. That's pretty cool stuff. All right, so I'm moving over to Power Automate Desktop. The team has published, and if you have not checked out Power Automate Desktop yet, I think now's the time. Man, this is so cool. I was talking to a colleague this morning who I've spent a lot of time with managing and automating parts of their job because there's a lot of systems, right? Excel, CRM, Teams, things going back and forth. I've worked a lot with this person on using Power Automate to assist with their job just internally. And I'm like, man, you need to check this out, because this is a lot of, speaking of last mile, right? A lot of the things that have been a challenge before to automate, just in your even just personal productivity. Yeah, of course, the RPA scenarios from a business perspective, but even I'm talking about just personal productivity, automating things on your desktop, Excel, some weird CRM thing. Some of the examples in the first videos are like, automating Notepad and just showing you how accessible and how easy it is to kind of get going. So definitely check this out.
Would you say if you were a person who used to play around with like VBA or WinBatch or any of those kind of things, like this stuff is really more approachable than that?
I was going to say, even if you were someone approaching that and not quite there, this is for you, right? And of course, if you were that person, this will make your life so much easier. But I would say, even if you're not someone who necessarily felt comfortable doing VBA or writing script, this is something that you can definitely do. I mean, for real,
Maybe we should do a little demo next week. What do you think?
I think that would be a good idea. I think it's time to kind of show this, and I think that it's kind of getting to the point where it's pretty mature.
Do a little show and tell show next week, maybe.
Yeah, I was actually trying to think of what's something that I do on a recurring basis that's kind of a PITA, right? And how can I automate that from my personal side? So I'm going to put my thinking cap on and see if I can come up with something, make a cool demo for next week. I'd like it to be personal to me, but we'll see what I can figure out. All right, last but not least, this is more of just a heads up. I don't think there's really any action here. This is for Power BI wonks and nerds and geeks out there. If you don't know, the language of so Power BI, let's step back, right, has the engine of analysis services behind the covers. That's when you bring data in and you store it. It's using something called the analysis services engine, which has its heritage over 20 years ago, right? So this has been around for a very, very, very long time. One of the original languages that analysis services spoke back then was called MDX. It speaks another language today called DAX. If you're into Power BI, you know what that is. but MDX has been around forever. So when Excel, for example, when you're doing a pivot table against Power BI data sets, it is actually speaking to Power BI through this language called MDX. And so just FYI, right? So this is, if you're deep into Power BI, you probably already know this, but so this is useful to know that there's been some major performance enhancements that are coming through MDX Fusion, which is basically making that language be more performant, right? And when you are speaking MDX to Power BI, to have the performance experience be better than it was. So, and I think more and more people are actually, given some of the capabilities that have been shipping to Power BI and just how we're kind of positioning and how people are moving towards more reusable data sets inside your organization. I think you're going to see more people connecting Excel to Power BI. So this is an important one. It probably speaks to the telemetry that we're seeing, that we'd invest in this and kind of start to improve on some of those things. So not really much of an action here. It's more of just, hey, here's what we're seeing. Here's some of the performance enhancements that you're going to be seeing, under the cover stuff, but really, really useful, especially if you have a large Excel base and you're trying to foster reuse of those data sets from Power BI to your Excel users. So MDX Fusion, it's exciting stuff.
I think, yeah, it's nice to see the performance. So that was kind of almost a wrap up for us for content this week.
I agree.
So I'll commit next week. I'm gonna give a preview of the GitHub of the new release of the distributed content and newsletter stuff, right?
Nice. Okay.
So the repo is not published yet, but I'm going to show the solution next week in advance of that, just kind of get some community feedback on it before I uncork it.
To do some Power BI, or not Power BI, Power Automate desktop stuff with some UI flows.
Yeah, so next week's going to be the whole, like, a user has a nice interface through a Power App. They submit a piece of content, and it generates programmatically a SharePoint news page. And there's also a search, sharing, and curation engine that's part of it. So we'll show that sort of kind of common requested corporate comms solution, for lack of a better term, or structured like news from the field that gets up curated and pushed in, but in a consistent format. So we'll show that one next week. You're going to do this. So we'll do a little demo next week.
Fun stuff.
That feels actionable to me. We've been talking a lot of news for a while. Time to nerd out. All right. Well, that was it. That was an Off/Flash Friday. Everybody have a great weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Cheers, everybody.
It's 83 in Minneapolis, so we just don't know what the heck the weather is here.
I don't even. I think it's going to get pretty. What is it? We're like in the we're in the low 70s here. That's crazy.
Well, there you go. All right then. Yeah. Right. So we're gonna try and win no matter what with the weather on top of Mr. Kidda on top of that. All right. So we're good to go. Right. You all have a fabulous week. We'll see you next week for another extraordinarily amazing Flash Friday.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Bye.